Grant Sterling swirled a glass of vintage Krug, the crystal catching the amber glow of the Metropolitan Museum's Great Hall. To the circle of hedge fund titans around him, he was the hero of a cautionary tale. "Elena?" he chuckled, the sound sharp as a blade. A lovely girl, truly, but she was a watercolor in a world of oil paintings. She was too plain, too quiet, lacking the architecture for high society. I tried to pull her up, but she preferred the smell of turpentine and Brooklyn dust to the fragrance of success. Some people are just born to be background noise. The Legacy Gala was not merely a party. It was a blood sport dressed in black tie. Under the towering arches of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York's old guard mingled with the new titans, creating a precarious ecosystem of wealth, ego, and quiet desperation. The air was a suffocating blend of expensive oud, floral arrangements that cost more than a mid-size sedan, and the electric hum of 1,000 secrets being traded in hushed tones. At the center of it all was Grant Sterling. At 39, Grant was the senior vice president of Crestview International, a man whose life was a series of curated victories. His tuxedo was bespoke brioni, his cufflinks were raw emeralds, and his smile was a masterpiece of practiced charisma. He moved through the room with the practiced ease of a man who owned the air he breathed. Clinging to his arm was Sloane Whitmore. She was the antithesis of everything Grant had left behind. Sloane was a creature of high-contrast beauty, platinum hair, a gown of liquid gold that left little to the imagination, and a family name that opened doors in the Hamptons and Saint-Tropez. She looked at Grant not as a partner, but as a trophy, a reflection of her own impeccable taste. "You're being wicked, Grant," Sloane murmured, her manicured fingers tracing the lapel of his jacket. Was she really that drab? "Worse," Grant replied, leaning in as if sharing a state secret. She had this way of making a room feel smaller. She didn't understand that in this city you are either the predator or the scenery. Elena chose to be the scenery. She spent her days in a paint-splattered oversized shirt, staring at canvases that looked like Rorschach tests for the depressed. I gave her 3 years of my life, trying to mold her into a woman who could stand on a stage like this. In the end, I realized you can't polish a stone that doesn't want to be a diamond. The men in the circle, Julian Thorne, a tech disruptor from Palo Alto, and Marcus Vane, a real estate mogul with a penchant for litigation, laughed in unison. It was a comfortable laughter, the kind that reinforced their own sense of belonging by mocking those who failed to fit. "It's a classic story," Marcus said, swirling his scotch. "The high flyer and the anchor. Glad you cut the rope, Sterling. Look at you now. You're on the verge of the Crestview partnership, and you've got a Whitmore on your arm. That's what I call an upgrade." Grant felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the champagne. This was the narrative he had carefully constructed. In his version of history, he was the long-suffering husband who had tried to save a whimsical, talentless artist from herself. He conveniently forgot the way he had once looked at Elena's early sketches with genuine awe. He erased the memory of the way her laughter used to make their cramped Brooklyn loft feel like a palace. Instead, he replaced those memories with a single sharp image, the night of the Solitude dinner. It was 3 years ago. Grant had been up for his first major promotion, and he needed to impress the CEO of Crestview, Arthur Penhaligon. He had begged Elena to hide her artistic messes, to put on a simple black dress, and to play the part of the supportive corporate wife. He wanted the apartment to look like a spread from Architectural Digest, cold, clean, and expensive. But Elena, in a rare moment of defiance, had hung her newest masterpiece in the dining room. It was a large, visceral canvas titled The Gilded Cage. It wasn't pretty. It was a storm of charcoal greys, bruised purples, and a singular tiny fleck of gold leaf trapped behind a heavy, textured lattice. Arthur Penhaligon had spent the entire dinner staring at it. He hadn't praised the catering. He hadn't discussed the merger. He had simply looked at the painting with a furrowed brow. Grant was convinced that Penhaligon saw it as a sign of instability, a glimpse into a household that was too emotional for the cold world of finance. Grant lost the promotion that year. He blamed Elena. He told her she was a liability. He told her she was a weight around his neck. 2 months later, he had walked out. "So whatever happened to her?" Julian asked, snapping Grant back to the present. "Did she move back to Ohio, or is she selling charcoal sketches on the subway?" Grant shrugged, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Last I heard, she'd crawled off to some cabin in the Hudson Valley. Probably has a little shop on Etsy selling paintings of cats to lonely librarians. She never had the stomach for the real world. She was too plain." He took another sip of Krug, feeling the bubbles hiss against his tongue. He looked around the hall at the $50,000 tables and the billionaires who could move markets with a whisper. This was the real world. This was where he belonged. He was the master of his universe, and Elena Vance was a footnote he had successfully edited out of his biography. But the atmosphere in the Great Hall was beginning to shift. It started near the grand entrance, a ripple of silence that moved through the crowd like a cold front. The frantic popping of paparazzi flashes outside grew into a rhythmic thunder pulsing through the glass doors. The socialites near the door stopped mid-sentence, their heads turning in unison. "What is that?" Sloane asked, standing on her tiptoes. "Is the governor here?" "Probably Silas Montgomery," Julian muttered, his voice dropping an octave in reverence. "The rumor was that he'd actually show up tonight. He hasn't attended a public event in New York in 5 years. The name Silas Montgomery carried more weight than any other in the room. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a phantom. A polymath who had made his first billion in clean energy before pivoting to become the world's most influential and reclusive art collector and venture philanthropist. He was a kingmaker. To be seen with Montgomery was to be anointed. Grant adjusted his tie, his competitive instincts kicking in. "If Silas is here, I need to find a way into his orbit. Sloane, stay close." The crowd parted instinctively, a sea of silk and wool receding to create a wide, respectful path. Through the archway walked a man who seemed to command the very light in the room. Silas Montgomery was 60, with a shock of silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored black suit. No flash, no emeralds. Just the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to prove. But it wasn't Silas who caused the collective gasp that echoed through the museum. It was the woman on his arm. She was draped in a gown of deep midnight emerald silk that moved like water. The dress was a feat of architectural genius, understated, elegant, and radiating a quiet power. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated knot, revealing a graceful neck adorned with a single stunning vintage necklace, a silver palette knife cast in diamonds and platinum. But it was her face that stopped Grant's heart. The plain girl from Brooklyn was gone. In her place stood a woman with a gaze so steady and serene it felt like a physical weight. Her skin glowed with an inner vitality that no makeup could replicate. She didn't look like she was trying to fit into high society. She looked like she had designed it. "My God," Marcus whispered, his glass hovering halfway to his mouth. "Who is that?" Grant couldn't speak. The champagne glass in his hand felt suddenly, dangerously heavy. His lungs refused to expand. He watched as the woman leaned into Silas Montgomery, sharing a private laugh that spoke of a deep, unshakable intimacy. She wasn't a watercolor anymore. She was the masterpiece. Beside him, Sloane's grip on his arm tightened until it was painful. "Grant?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and sudden, sharp insecurity. "Grant, why are you looking at her like that? Who is she?" Grant's mouth went dry as he watched the woman turn her head. Her eyes swept across the room, past the titans and the socialites, past the ice sculptures and the floral towers, and then, for a fraction of a second, her gaze landed on him. There was no anger. There was no shock. There was only a cool, devastating indifference. It was Elena, and as Silas Montgomery led her toward the center of the room, Grant realized with a sickening jolt that the plain woman he had discarded wasn't just at the gala. She was the reason the gala existed. The silence that followed Elena's entrance was not a lack of sound, but a vacuum of breath. In the high-stakes theater of New York's social elite, silence was the loudest form of applause, and Elena Vance, the woman Grant had spent the last hour vivisecting for sport, was currently receiving a standing ovation of stares. Grant felt the bile rise in his throat, a bitter contrast to the expensive champagne. He watched, paralyzed, as Silas Montgomery leaned down to whisper something in Elena's ear. She laughed, a genuine melodic sound that Grant hadn't heard in years. In their Brooklyn apartment, her laughter had been stifled, clipped by his constant reminders that they had neighbors to consider, or that she was being too much. Here, under the watchful eyes of the city's most powerful, her joy seemed to occupy more space than the ice sculptures. "Grant," Sloane hissed again, her voice now a sharp needle of panic. "Who is she? Everyone is looking at us. Why is Marcus Thorne staring at you like you're a ghost?" "It's no one," Grant snapped, though his voice lacked its usual steel. It's Elena, my ex-wife." Sloane's jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to unhinge. She looked from Grant's pale, sweat-slicked face to the emerald-clad vision standing 10 feet away. The comparison was instantaneous and, for Sloane, devastating. Sloane was a product of artifice. The fillers, the hair extensions, the desperate need to be seen. Elena looked as though she had been forged in a different fire entirely. She looked authentic. "The painter," Sloane whispered, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "The one you said was too plain for this room? Grant, she's wearing the Veronique emeralds. Those haven't been seen since the Sotheby's private auction in Paris last year. They're worth more than your entire firm's quarterly earnings." Grant's eyes locked onto the necklace. The silver palette knife encrusted with diamonds hung at the center of the emeralds. It was a slap in the face, a literal jewel made from the tool of the trade he had told her was a waste of time. "It's a costume," Grant lied, his mind racing to find a narrative that didn't end in his total humiliation. "She must be a project for Montgomery. You know how these billionaires get. They find a charity case to dress up for the season to prove they have a soul. She's probably terrified." But as he watched her, it became clear that Elena was anything but terrified. She moved through the room with a fluid, feline grace. When Julian Thorne, the tech disruptor who had laughed loudest at Grant's jokes, approached her, Grant expected her to falter. Instead, she took Julian's hand with a firm, practiced grip. "Julian," she said, her voice carrying through a sudden lull in the music, "I read your piece in the Journal on decentralized finance. Bold, though I think you underestimated the volatility of the European markets. Silas and I were discussing it just this morning over coffee." Julian didn't just look impressed, he looked starstruck. Yes, Mrs. Vance, I mean Elena. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the impact of ESG metrics on art as an asset class." Grant felt a cold shiver. Mrs. Vance. Julian hadn't even looked at Grant. The circle of men who had been Grant's loyal subjects moments ago was now drifting toward Elena like iron filings to a magnet. "I have to go over there," Grant muttered, his ego overriding his common sense. I need to clear the air. People are getting the wrong idea." "Grant, don't," Sloane warned, grabbing his sleeve. "You're making a mistake. Look at her. She isn't the woman you told me about." "I made her," Grant hissed, pulling his arm away. "I'm the reason she even knows what a gala is. She's playing a part, Sloane, and I'm the only one who knows the lines." He began to push through the crowd, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The master of the universe was starting to fray at the seams. As he approached the inner circle surrounding Silas and Elena, the conversation died down. The air grew heavy with the kind of tension that preceded a train wreck. Silas Montgomery turned first. His eyes were like twin chips of flint, cold and unyielding. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a smile. He simply stood there, a wall of billion-dollar indifference. "Grant Sterling," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "I believe you're with Crestview. I was just discussing your firm with the board. Aggressive, perhaps a bit short-sighted." The insult, delivered with such casual precision, hit Grant like a physical blow. But he couldn't focus on Silas. His eyes were locked on Elena. Up close, she was even more breathtaking. The faint scent of sandalwood and something crisp, like rain on stone, clung to her. "Elena!" Grant said, his voice cracking. He tried to reclaim his husband tone, the one that usually made her shrink, the one that reminded her of her place. You look different. I see you've found someone to fund your little hobby." The room went deathly silent. It was a tactical error of such magnitude that even Marcus Vane winced. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't blush. She didn't even look angry. She looked at Grant with a profound, terrifying pity. It was the look one gives a wounded animal or a broken toy. "My hobby, Grant?" she asked softly. Her voice wasn't the trembling whisper he remembered. It was resonant, cultured, and entirely in control. "Is that what you call a 3-year residency at the Hudson Institute, followed by a solo exhibition at the Gagosian that sold out in 20 minutes? I suppose from the perspective of a man who only measures value in stock tickers, art must seem like a very small thing." I didn't know about the Gagosian," Grant stammered, the blood draining from his face. "You never told me." "I told you every single day," Elena interrupted, her eyes never leaving his. "But you weren't listening, Grant. You were too busy listening to the sound of your own voice, telling me I was plain, telling me I was a liability, telling me I would be nothing without you." She took a step closer, and instinctively Grant took a step back. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. "You were right about one thing, though," she continued, her gaze dropping to his perfectly knotted Brioni tie. "I didn't fit into this world, not your version of it. I was too quiet because I was observing. I was too plain because I refused to be a billboard for your ego. But Silas saw something you couldn't. He didn't see a watercolor, Grant. He saw a legacy." Silas placed a protective hand on the small of Elena's back. "We have the unveiling to attend to, Elena. The director is waiting." "Of course," Elena said, giving Grant a final neutral nod. "Enjoy the Krug, Grant. I believe it's the only thing in this room you truly understand." As they walked away, the crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Grant stood frozen, the center of a silent, judging circle. He could feel the eyes of every major player in Manhattan on him. He wasn't the senior VP of Crestview anymore. He wasn't the man with the Vanderbilt-adjacent girlfriend. He was the man who had discarded a diamond because he was too stupid to realize it wasn't a rock. "Grant," Sloane's voice was a whisper from behind him. "We should leave, now." "No," Grant said, his jaw tightening. His humiliation was curdling into a desperate, frantic rage. "We're staying. She thinks she's won. This is just the beginning. I know where the bodies are buried, Sloane. I know how she got that residency. She's a fraud, and I'm going to prove it." He didn't see the way Julian Thorne moved away from him, his phone already out, sending a message that would, by morning, be the top story on page 6. Grant was so blinded by the need to reclaim his power that he failed to notice the massive velvet-draped easel at the far end of the hall. He failed to notice the way the museum director was looking at him with a mixture of disgust and cold calculation. But most of all, he failed to notice that Elena hadn't just arrived at the gala. She had brought the storm with her. The air in the great hall had grown thinner, a shimmering veil of tension that seemed to vibrate with every chime of a silver spoon against fine bone china. Grant Sterling stood by the bar, his knuckles white as he gripped a fresh glass of scotch. The Krug was no longer enough. He needed something that burned, something that could cauterize the raw wound Elena had just ripped open in his pride. Sloane was no longer clinging to his arm. She stood 3 feet away, her body angled toward the center of the room, her eyes darting between the VIP circle and the exit. She looked like a survivor gauging which lifeboat was least likely to sink. "Grant, we need to talk about what she said," Sloane whispered, her voice tight with the kind of social anxiety that only affects those whose entire identity is alone from their parents. "The Gagosian, a residency? If she's the Elena Vance that Vogue has been teasing for the September issue, then you've made us both look like prehistoric fools. You told everyone she was a hobbyist. You told the board of Crestview she was a liability." "She was a liability," Grant hissed, the scotch doing nothing to dull his edge. "She was a ghost in my house, Sloane. If she's found success now, it's because she's using Montgomery's money to buy her way into the galleries. You know how the art world works. It's not about the brushstroke, it's about the checkbook." But his words felt like ash. Across the room, he saw Arthur Penhaligon, the silver-maned CEO of Crestview International, deep in conversation with Silas Montgomery. Grant's heart did a slow, sickening roll. Arthur hadn't looked at Grant once tonight. 3 years ago, Grant had been the golden boy, the heir apparent. Now he felt like a stain on the marble floor, driven by a frantic, jagged impulse, the kind of mistake a man makes when he believes the floor is falling out from under him. Grant pushed away from the bar. He didn't head for the exit. He headed straight for Arthur and Silas. "Arthur," Grant said, forced joviality coating his voice like cheap varnish. He stepped into the circle, ignoring the way Silas's eyes narrowed into slits of pure billionaire-grade ice. "A hell of an evening, isn't it? I was just telling Sloane how remarkable it is to see Silas supporting local talent. Small world, isn't it? Elena and I, well, we have quite the history." Arthur Penhaligon turned slowly. He looked at Grant not with anger, but with a weary, clinical boredom. "History is an interesting word, Grant. Usually it implies something that stays in the past, but I've been hearing a lot of history tonight, mostly about a dinner party 3 years ago." Grant's smile faltered. "The dinner? Arthur, I told you Elena was going through a phase. She wasn't herself that night." "No," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a register that made the surrounding socialites lean in. "She was exactly herself. I remember that painting, Grant, The Gilded Cage. I didn't pass you over for the promotion because of the art. I passed you over because I watched you spend 4 hours trying to extinguish the light in your wife's eyes. I watched a man who was so terrified of a woman's talent that he tried to frame it as a mental breakdown. I don't promote men who are that insecure. It's bad for the bottom line." The silence that followed was a physical weight. Silas Montgomery took a slow sip of his water, his gaze never leaving Grant's face. "You see, Mr. Sterling," Silas began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "I don't just collect art. I collect people who are brave enough to tell the truth. Elena came to me 3 years ago, not for money, but for a place to hide while she rebuilt the soul you tried to strip mine. She arrived at my estate in the Hudson with nothing but a suitcase and a single rusted palette knife. She told me she was done being plain. She was ready to be honest." Silas reached out and adjusted the diamond-encrusted palette knife on Elena's necklace, which he had stepped away from her to address Grant specifically. It was a gesture of ownership, not of the woman, but of the narrative. "I was the anonymous buyer of The Gilded Cage, by the way," Silas added, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. "I keep it in my study. It reminds me that some people are so hollow they'll try to fill their emptiness with someone else's shadows." "I'm not hollow," Grant stammered, his ego flailing. "I'm a partner at one of the top firms in the city. You have a reputation that is currently evaporating," Arthur Penhaligon interrupted. "We'll discuss your future at Crestview on Monday morning, Grant. For now, I think you've contributed enough to the atmosphere of this evening." Grant felt the world tilt. The master of the universe was being dismissed like a footman. He looked around for Sloane, but she had already drifted away, currently laughing at something Julian Thorne was saying near the fountain. He was alone in a room of 500 people, and for the first time in his life he realized that high society wasn't a club he belonged to. It was a mirror, and it was currently reflecting a man who was utterly, devastatingly small. He should have left then. He should have taken the shred of dignity he had left and walked out into the New York night. But the mistake, the true, soul-crushing error, was yet to come. He saw Elena standing near the stage, her back to him as she spoke with the museum director. The spotlight for the unveiling was being tested, a sharp beam of white light cutting through the dimness. Grant didn't think, he didn't plan, he simply moved. He bypassed the security guards, his familiar face, and his still valid VIP lanyard, acting as a temporary shield. He reached the stage just as the director stepped away to fetch his notes. "Elena," he hissed, grabbing her by the elbow. She turned, her face a mask of calm that infuriated him more than a scream would have. She didn't pull away, she just looked at his hand on her arm as if it were a curious, unpleasant insect. "Grant, you really should be heading home. You've had quite a bit to drink." "Is this what you wanted?" he whispered, his face inches from hers. The smell of scotch and desperation rolled off him. "To humiliate me? To use Silas to take away everything I worked for? You were always so pure, so above it all. But look at you. You're just another social climber, trading your dignity for a seat at the table. You're not an artist, you're a performance." Elena looked at him, and for a second, a flash of the old Elena, the one who used to apologize for taking up space, flickered in her eyes. But it was swallowed by a cold, hard light. "I didn't have to do anything to humiliate you, Grant," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a caress. "You did it yourself. You spent years building a house of cards out of other people's failures. I just finally decided to stop being one of the cards." She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear, mimicking the way he used to demean her in public. "The painting under that velvet, Grant. I didn't paint it for Silas. I didn't paint it for the museum. I painted it for you. I wanted you to see exactly what you look like when you aren't looking in a mirror." She pulled back, her eyes bright with a terrifying clarity. "Now, let go of my arm before I have Silas call the police. You aren't my husband anymore. You aren't my master. You're just a man standing in the way of my work." Grant's hand dropped. He felt a coldness settle in his bones that no amount of scotch could thaw. He watched as Elena stepped onto the podium, the lights catching the emeralds at her throat, turning them into 1,000 green eyes. The museum director tapped the microphone. The hum of the room died down to a sharp, expectant silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director began, "tonight we are privileged to witness the birth of a new icon in American art, a woman who reminds us that the greatest masterpieces are often the ones we try to hide." Grant stood at the edge of the stage, frozen in the shadows, as the director reached for the velvet cord. He knew with a sudden crystalline horror that whatever was under that cloth was going to be the final nail in the coffin of Grant Sterling. He didn't move. He couldn't. He was a spectator at his own execution. The velvet fabric didn't just fall. It hissed as it slid off the canvas, a sound like a long-held breath finally being released. For a heartbeat, the great hall of the Metropolitan Museum was so silent that Grant could hear the frantic thudding of his own pulse against his eardrums. Then, a collective, sharp intake of air rippled through the 500 guests, followed by a low, sibilant wave of whispers that felt like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at Grant's skin. The painting was titled "The Architect of Absence." It was a staggering, visceral work of oil and mixed media, nearly 7 feet tall. It depicted a man, unmistakably Grant, though his features were rendered with a cold, almost surgical precision, standing in a glass-walled office that hovered over a dark, swirling Manhattan. He was dressed in a suit that looked like it was made of cold, grey currency, his hands reaching out to grasp at a flurry of falling stock tickers that turned to ash before he could touch them. But the true devastation lay in the reflection. In the glass wall of the office, the man's face was not a face at all. It was a hollow, silvered void, reflecting the sterile luxury of the room behind him. And there, in the far corner of the canvas, was the silhouette of a woman, Elena, walking out of a door that was cracked open, letting in a flood of warm, golden, uncurated light. She wasn't looking back. She was leaving a man who had become nothing more than the sum of his possessions. It was a public vivisection. "My God," someone whispered loudly from the front row. "It's him. It's Sterling." Grant felt the world begin to dissolve at the edges. The spotlight that illuminated the painting seemed to bleed over, catching him in its harsh, unforgiving glow. He was no longer the senior VP of Crestview. He was the hollow man. He looked at the canvas and saw every cruel word he'd ever said to Elena, every time he'd called her plain, every time he'd told her she was lucky to have him. She hadn't just painted his likeness. She had captured his soul's bankruptcy. Elena stepped to the microphone. The light from the emeralds at her throat seemed to pulse with every word she spoke. "Art is often called a mirror," she began, her voice steady and resonant, devoid of the tremors he'd spent years instilling in her. "But sometimes it is a window. For a long time, I lived in a world where worth was measured in spreadsheets and the height of a ceiling. I was told that my voice was too quiet, that my dreams were hobbies, and that I was merely the background for someone else's success." She looked directly at Grant then. It wasn't a look of triumph. It was something far worse. It was the look of a scientist observing a specimen that had finally ceased to be interesting. "This piece is about the moment I realized that the cage I was in had no bars," she continued. "Only illusions. I donate The Architect of Absence to the Metropolitan Museum tonight as a reminder to anyone who feels small. The people who try to diminish you are usually the ones who are most afraid of your light. They aren't predators. They are just empty." The applause started as a low rumble and grew into a deafening roar. Silas Montgomery stepped forward, placing a hand on the small of Elena's back, a gesture that was both protective and profoundly respectful. Grant felt a hand on his shoulder, but it wasn't a friend's. It was a museum security guard, flanked by two others. "Mr. Sterling," the guard whispered, his voice firm, "I think it's time for you to leave. You're causing a disturbance." "A disturbance?" Grant choked out, his face a mottled purple. "I'm a VIP. I'm a partner at Crestview. That woman, that's my wife. She's using my life for her ex-wife," the guard corrected, "and Mr. Montgomery has requested that you be escorted out. Please, sir, don't make this a scene." But the scene was already happening. As Grant was led away, the crowd parted not with respect, but with a visceral, visible disgust. He saw Marcus Vane turn his back. He saw Julian Thorne raise a glass to Elena, pointedly ignoring Grant's existence. And then he saw Sloane. She was standing near the exit, her wrap draped over her arm, her face a mask of cold, dawning horror. "Sloane," Grant pleaded as he was marched past her. Tell them this is a lie." Sloane looked at him, and for the first time she saw the man in the painting. She saw the hollow reflection. She saw the desperation of a man who had nothing left but his ego. "Don't call me Grant," she said, her voice flat. "I've spent my whole life trying to get into this room. I'm not going to let a hollow man pull me out of it." She turned and walked back into the fray, heading straight for the VIP circle where Elena was now surrounded by senators and critics. The cool night air of Fifth Avenue hit Grant like a physical blow. The sirens of the city screamed around him, a mocking chorus. He stood on the sidewalk, the grand stone steps of the museum behind him, feeling like a ghost. He reached into his pocket for his phone, his fingers trembling. He needed to call the office. He needed to talk to the PR team. He needed to fix this. But when he turned on the screen, the first notification wasn't from his team. It was a news alert from Bloomberg. Breaking. Montgomery Industries finalizes hostile takeover of Crestview International. Parent company assets to be liquidated and reorganized under new legacy arts fund. Grant's phone slipped from his hand, the glass shattering on the concrete. The takeover. Silas Montgomery hadn't just taken Elena, he had bought Grant's entire world. Crestview, the firm Grant had sacrificed his marriage for, the firm he had bullied and bled for, was gone. It was being turned into a fund to support the very artists Grant had mocked. He looked up at the museum's banners, snapping in the wind. Elena's name was there, though he hadn't noticed it before. It was everywhere. He was 39 years old, and he was a man without a country. He had no wife, no partner, no firm, and no reputation. He was the plain one now. He was the background noise. Inside the museum, the music swelled, a triumphant orchestral piece that seemed to celebrate his departure. Grant stood in the shadow of the great building, a hollow silhouette in a city of lights. He remembered the palette knife necklace around Elena's neck, the diamond-encrusted tool of the trade. He realized then that she hadn't just painted him, she had scraped him away, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the truth. And the truth was a silence he didn't know how to fill. He began to walk, his Brioni shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement, heading toward the subway. He didn't have a car waiting. He didn't have a home he wanted to go to. He just walked, a man-shaped void disappearing into the anonymity of the New York night. The interior of Silas Montgomery's Maybach was a sanctuary of butter-soft leather and a silence so profound it felt like being underwater. Outside, the neon pulse of Manhattan blurred into streaks of electric blue and amber, but inside, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a dashboard clock. Elena leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. The emerald necklace felt heavy now, not just with the weight of the stones, but with the gravity of the evening. She reached up, her thumb tracing the diamond-encrusted palette knife. It was sharp, a reminder that the tools of creation could also be the tools of surgery. "You're very quiet, Elena," Silas said. He wasn't looking at her. He was leafing through a leather-bound folder, but his attention was entirely focused on her. Most artists would be drinking vintage champagne from the bottle after a night like that. You just dismantled a man and a corporation in the span of 3 hours. "I didn't want to dismantle him, Silas," Elena said, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. "I just wanted to stop carrying him. The painting. I've been working on it for 18 months. Every time I thought I was finished, I'd remember something else he said. A comment about my hair, a sigh when I bought new brushes, the way he looked at his watch when I tried to tell him about a dream. I had to put it all somewhere so it wouldn't be inside me anymore." Silas closed the folder and finally looked at her. His eyes were kind, but they held the hardness of a man who had seen the world for exactly what it was. "Revenge is a byproduct, Elena. It's the exhaust of a moving engine. You're moving now. Grant is stationary. That is the true difference between you." He reached into the console and pulled out a tablet, sliding it toward her. The screen was a chaotic kaleidoscope of social media feeds and news alerts. The Hollow Man had already gone viral. A high-resolution photo of the painting was being shared alongside clips of Grant being escorted out by security. The headlines were brutal. "The Art of the Takeover. Montgomery acquires Crestview as artist ex-wife delivers final blow." From plain to platinum, Elena Vance's masterpiece vivisects Wall Street ego. But it was the comments that hit her hardest. Thousands of women and men were sharing stories of their own hollow partners. They were calling Elena a symbol of the quiet rebellion. They were seeing themselves in the golden light of the doorway she had painted. "He'll try to fight," Elena whispered. "He's a cornered animal now. He doesn't know how to exist without being the most important person in the room." "Let him fight," Silas said simply. "I've already initiated the audit of Crestview. By Monday morning, his digital access will be revoked. By Tuesday, the Hollow Man will be the only thing New York remembers about Grant Sterling." While Elena sat in the silence of the Maybach, Grant Sterling was standing in the middle of his Upper East Side penthouse, a space that felt suddenly like a sterile, high-altitude tomb. The apartment was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury, grey marble, white leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a city that currently despised him. He was still in his tuxedo, though the jacket was discarded on the floor and his tie hung loose like a noose. His phone was buzzing incessantly on the kitchen island, a frantic vibrating insect that wouldn't die. Call from Julian Thorne, declined. Call from Marcus Vane, declined. Text from Sloane Whitmore, blocked. He ignored them all and went to the liquor cabinet, grabbing a bottle of Macallan 25. He didn't bother with a glass. The burn of the scotch was the only thing that made him feel alive. "She cheated," he muttered to the empty room, his voice cracking. "She used Montgomery. She seduced him. She played the victim until he gave her a stage." He stumbled toward the window, looking at his reflection in the glass. For a terrifying second, he didn't see himself. He saw the painting. He saw a man with a silver void for a face, reflecting nothing but the cold, expensive furniture of his life. He slammed his fist against the glass, the sound echoing through the hollow apartment. He grabbed his phone and dialed his lawyer, Leo Katz. "Leo, it's Grant. I want to sue. Defamation, libel, emotional distress. I want her ruined, and I want an injunction against the acquisition. Montgomery is using inside information from my ex-wife to tank my firm's value." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Grant," Leo's voice was weary. "I've seen the news. I've seen the painting. You can't sue an artist for a metaphorical representation of her own marriage. It's protected expression. And as for the acquisition, the board of Crestview voted unanimously to accept the deal an hour ago. They saw the writing on the wall. The Hollow Man painting wasn't just art, Grant. It was a PR nightmare that made your firm radioactive. The board wanted out before the stock hit zero." "I'm the senior VP," Grant roared. "They can't sell the firm out from under me." "You were the senior VP, Grant. As of 10 minutes ago, Montgomery Industries has issued a statement. All senior leadership at Crestview is being placed on administrative leave pending a forensic audit. Your contract has a conduct unbecoming clause. Silas Montgomery is a shark, Grant. He didn't just buy your company, he bought your exit." Grant threw the phone. It hit the marble backsplash and shattered, the screen glowing for a final second before going dark. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed million-dollar deals, the hands that had once pushed Elena's sketches off the table to make room for his laptop. They were shaking. He was 39 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was invisible. Sunday morning in the Hudson Valley felt like a different planet. Elena sat on the porch of the cottage Silas had helped her secure 2 years ago, not a charity case rental, but a studio she had earned through her first sold-out show. The air smelled of damp pine and wood smoke. She was wearing an oversized paint-stained shirt and jeans. No emeralds, no silk, just the quiet weight of herself. She held a cup of coffee and watched the mist lift off the river. On the table beside her was a small, tattered watercolor sketch. It was the one she had tried to show Grant years ago, a simple, honest study of a wilting flower. He had called it despair. He had called it scenery. She looked at it now and realized he was right, but not in the way he thought. It was scenery. It was the background for the person she was becoming. Her laptop chimed. It was an email from the museum director. "Elena, the response to Architect of Absence is unprecedented. We've had to increase security for the gallery tomorrow. Also, a private collector has reached out." They don't want to buy the painting. They know it's ours now, but they want to commission a series. They want to know if you can paint the architecture of presence." Elena smiled. It wasn't the sharp, jagged smile of someone who had won a fight. It was the soft, steady glow of someone who had found their way home. She looked at the blank canvas waiting for her inside the studio. The light was perfect. Golden, uncurated, and entirely hers. But then a black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. Elena stood up, her heart skipping a beat. Silas usually called before coming. She watched the door open, expecting his silver hair and tailored suit. Instead, a woman stepped out. It was Sloane Whitmore. She looked different without the golden gala dress and the frantic need to be noticed. She looked exhausted. She was holding a small, heavy box. "Elena," Sloane said, her voice barely a whisper across the yard. "I'm not here for him. I'm here because I think I'm the woman in the painting too. Or I was until Friday night." She held out the box. "He left this in my car when he was being removed. I think it belongs to you. And I think you're the only one who can tell me how to get out of the cage." Elena looked at the box, then at the woman who had replaced her, then at the empty road behind her. The escalation wasn't over. The fallout of Grant Sterling's ego was wider than she had imagined, and the plain girl from Brooklyn was no longer just a painter. She was a map. The gravel of the driveway crunched under Sloane Whitmore's designer flats, a sound that felt jarringly loud in the cathedral-like silence of the Hudson Valley morning. Elena remained on the porch, her hand tightening around her coffee mug. She watched the woman who had been the upgrade, the platinum blonde currency Grant had used to pay for his seat at the high table, as she approached with the tentative steps of someone walking through a minefield. Sloane looked smaller than she had under the museum's chandeliers. The armor of high fashion was gone, replaced by a simple trench coat and a face that looked like it had been scrubbed raw by tears and late-night realizations. She reached the bottom of the porch steps and stopped, holding out the heavy mahogany box. "He called it his Archive of Amateurs," Sloane said, her voice trembling. "He kept it in the back of the walk-in closet, behind the safe where he keeps the Patek collection. After he was escorted out, he came back to the apartment in a state I can only describe as feral. He was throwing things. He was screaming about how you were a fraud. He left this on the seat of my car before he went to find his war room team. I opened it. Elena set her mug down and slowly took the box. She knew the weight of it. She knew the smell of the wood. When she lifted the lid, the scent of old charcoal and dried linseed oil wafted out, hitting her like a physical blow to the chest. Inside were her early sketches, the ones Grant had told her he'd thrown away in the Brooklyn dumpster 3 years ago. There were the plain drawings of the wilting flowers, the studies of the light hitting their cracked kitchen tile, and the portraits she had done of him while he slept. But they weren't just sketches anymore. Across every single one of them, Grant had used a red Sharpie to write lacking, unsellable, and trash. He hadn't thrown them away. He had kept them as trophies of his perceived superiority. He had curated a museum of her supposed failures to keep his own ego fed. "He's not stopping, Elena," Sloane whispered, stepping up onto the porch. "He's at a hotel in Midtown with a PR firm that specializes in scorched earth campaigns. They're drafting a narrative that you and Silas Montgomery have been in a domestic partnership for years, that the residency was a payoff, and that you're just a puppet for Silas's tax write-offs. He's going to go on the Today Show or CNN and play the part of the betrayed, hard-working husband whose wife was bought by a billionaire." Elena looked down at her sketches, the red ink bleeding into the charcoal like open wounds. A year ago, this would have broken her. She would have retreated into the shadows, apologizing for the trouble she'd caused. But as she looked at the red trash written over a portrait of her own younger, hopeful face, she felt something new. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, crystalline resolve. "He still thinks the world is a spreadsheet," Elena said softly. "He thinks he can just edit the entries until the balance looks the way he wants. But art doesn't work that way. The truth doesn't work that way." She looked at Sloane, really looked at her. "Why are you here, Sloane? You could have stayed on the sidelines. You could have just disappeared and let the lawyers handle the fallout." Sloane's eyes filled with a sudden, fierce light. "Because when I looked at that painting at the Met, the man with the hollow face, I realized I wasn't the woman leaving through the door. I was the woman standing in the shadows, waiting for him to notice me. I realized that if I stayed with him, I would eventually become a sketch in that box with unsellable written across my heart. I don't want to be background noise anymore, Elena. I want to be real." In that moment, the American soap opera of their lives shifted. The wife and the mistress, though Sloane had never been that in the traditional sense, were no longer rivals for the affection of a hollow man. They were two survivors of a hurricane, standing on the same piece of high ground. The war room was a suite at the St. Regis, thick with the smell of stale coffee and the frantic clicking of laptops. Grant Sterling stood by the window, his eyes bloodshot, his phone glued to his ear. "I don't care about the conduct clause, Leo," he roared into the phone. "I want the tabloids fed. I want every gallery owner in the city to think twice before hanging a Vance. Call the Post. Tell them we have receipts. Tell them she was a shut-in with a history of delusions." He hung up and turned to the two young, hungry-looking PR consultants he'd hired with the last of his personal liquid assets. "Where are we on the Montgomery Vance timeline?" "We've leaked the anonymous tips about the Hudson Valley residency," the lead consultant, a man named Caleb, said. "The narrative is gaining traction on Twitter. People love a billionaire puppet master story. But Grant, we have a problem. The museum just released a high-def video of the unveiling speech. Her Gilded Cage series is trending, and the comments are, well, they aren't on our side. Women are calling her the patron saint of starting over." "Then find more dirt!" Grant slammed his palm onto a mahogany desk. "There has to be something. A disgruntled teacher, a failed commission, a debt she didn't pay. I built that woman from the ground up. I taught her how to speak, how to dress, how to pretend she mattered. No one sells out a Gagosian show without a machine behind them." He caught his reflection in the gilded mirror of the suite. He looked frantic. He looked like the man in the painting, though he refused to see it. In his mind, he was still the architect. He was just rebuilding. "Sir," Caleb said, looking up from his tablet, "there's a live stream starting. It's from the Metropolitan Museum, a special press conference. Silas Montgomery is there, and so is Elena. And, wait, is that Sloane Whitmore?" Grant lunged for the tablet. On the screen, the grand steps of the Met were crowded with reporters. Silas Montgomery stood at the podium, but he wasn't the one speaking. Elena stood in the center, flanked by the museum director and, shockingly, Sloane Whitmore. Elena wasn't wearing couture. She was wearing a simple dark suit, her hair pulled back, looking every bit the serious academic she had become. "I am here today not to discuss art," Elena said into the cluster of microphones, her voice echoing across the plaza, "but to discuss the architecture of silence. For years I was told that my value was a derivative of someone else's success. I was told that the tools of my trade were toys. This morning I received a box of my early work that had been kept and defaced by my former husband, Grant Sterling, as a means of maintaining a narrative of my inadequacy." She held up the sketch of the wilting flower, the red trash visible to the cameras. The crowd of reporters gasped, the sound a soft, collective hiss of indignation. "This is what happens when we allow hollow men to design our lives," Elena continued, her gaze piercing the camera lens, and, Grant felt, piercing his soul. "They don't see the world. They see only what they can control. Today, Silas Montgomery and I are announcing the Foundations of Presence grant. It will be funded by the liquidation of the Crestview International executive bonuses, funds that were reclaimed during the acquisition audit. This grant will provide legal and artistic resources for women who are seeking to reclaim their identities from abusive or stifling environments. Then she stepped aside. Sloane Whitmore stepped to the microphone. "I am the first recipient of that support," Sloane said, her voice clear and unafraid. "I was a woman who thought beauty was a currency. I was a woman who thought being a trophy was a career, but I've learned that a golden cage is still a cage. I'm here to say that Grant Sterling didn't just lose his firm, he lost the power to define us." Grant watched the screen as the reporters erupted in questions. He saw the Hollow Man painting being projected onto a giant screen behind them. He saw the world, his world, nodding in agreement. "They're destroying us," Caleb whispered, his face pale. "This isn't just a PR hit. This is a total social erasure. Grant, we have to go. The lawyers for the audit are downstairs. They have a subpoena for your personal accounts." But Grant couldn't move. He was staring at the screen, at the way Elena and Sloane stood together. He saw the way the golden light of the afternoon sun hit them, making them look solid, vibrant, and utterly real. He looked back at the gilded mirror in the room. He saw the heavy, ornate frame. He saw the expensive silk wallpaper. But when he looked for himself, he saw only a blur of grey and white. The escalation had reached its peak. The show-up wasn't a confrontation in a boardroom. It was a revelation on the world stage. Elena hadn't just arrived at the gala, she had changed the rules of the game. He realized then that she hadn't been plain because she lacked color. She had been plain because she was the canvas, and he had been trying to paint a lie over her for years. Now the canvas was clean, and she was the one holding the brush. The door to the hotel suite burst open, not with the fire of an explosion, but with the cold, rhythmic tread of men in dark suits, forensic auditors, process servers. The reality Grant had tried to manipulate had finally arrived to claim its due. Grant Sterling, the man who believed he was the master of his universe, took a final staggering sip of his scotch. The ice rattled against the glass, the only applause he had left. The St. Regis Suite, which had only days ago pulsed with the frantic energy of a man convinced he could outrun his own shadow, was now as silent as a tomb. The gold-leaf mirrors still hung on the walls, but they reflected a wreckage that no amount of maid service could fix. Legal documents were scattered like autumn leaves across the Persian rugs, and the air smelled of stale scotch and the metallic tang of fear. Grant Sterling sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, his head in his hands. He was no longer the senior vice president of Crestview International. He was defendant number one. The forensic audit Silas Montgomery had launched hadn't just found conduct unbecoming, it had found a labyrinth of offshore accounts, kickbacks from real estate developers, and a systematic embezzlement scheme that Grant had used to fund the very lifestyle he'd used to belittle Elena. His lawyer, Leo Katz, stood by the door, checking his watch with the clinical detachment of a man who had already billed his final hour and was ready to move on to a client who still had a future. "It's over, Grant," Leo said, his voice flat. "The DA's office is moving for an indictment by Friday. Silas Montgomery didn't just buy the firm, he bought the whistleblowers. Your war room consultants, they've already turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity. They gave up the digital logs of the defamation campaign you tried to launch against Elena." Grant looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "I can fix it. I just need to talk to her. She's soft, Leo. She's always been soft. If I can just get her alone, remind her of what we had." "What you had was a hostage situation disguised as a marriage," Leo interrupted, grabbing his briefcase. "She isn't soft anymore, Grant. She's made of the same diamonds she's wearing. You tried to paint her as a fraud, and in doing so, you gave her the perfect canvas to show the world exactly who you are. I'm out. My firm is resigning as your counsel." As Leo walked out, the door clicked shut with a sound of absolute finality. Grant was alone. He looked at his phone, the new one he'd bought after smashing the last, and saw a notification from a private gallery in Chelsea. Private viewing, Elena Vance. The architecture of presence. Invite only. A jagged, desperate idea took root in his mind. It was the emotional fantasy of the gambler who believes the next hand will change everything. He didn't see the irony. He didn't see the danger. He only saw a chance to be seen one last time. The gallery was a cathedral of white light and soaring ceilings. It was the polar opposite of the dark, cluttered Brooklyn loft or the sterile, grey penthouse. Here, the air was filled with the scent of fresh lilies and the hum of sophisticated, quiet conversation. Elena stood at the far end of the room, surrounded by a group of women. She wasn't the center of a circle anymore. She was part of a community. Beside her was Sloane Whitmore, looking vibrant in a simple navy wrap dress, her eyes bright with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with a man's approval. The new series was a revelation. If the Gala painting had been a vivisection, these were healings. Large, luminous canvases that explored the beauty of the plane, the way light hit a simple wooden chair, the intricate map of veins in a leaf, the strength in a pair of hands stained with work. It was art that didn't demand attention, it commanded respect. The heavy glass doors of the gallery opened and a hush fell over the room. This story of Elena's reclamation reminds us that our value is never defined by those who cannot see our light. If this cinematic journey of sweet revenge and authentic growth moved you, please hit the like button and share it with anyone who needs a reminder of their own worth. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more deep dive dramas and inspiring real-life fiction stories that explore the complexities of the human spirit. What part of Elena's journey resonated with you most? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our story.